Hi, welcome to History's Heroes and Villains. My name is Jack Maley, and I'll be the host for this podcast. We are in an English 1102 group working on a project on science fiction. Science fiction, while sometimes seeming out there and unrealistic, has the uncanny ability to reflect the problems of our world and the anxieties of our time. Because of this, our group has been doing research on different decades of sci-fi, looking for trends and continuities that may reveal what was going on in the world at that time. We discovered that heroes and villains in sci-fi stories often serve as a proxy for current cultural trends. Today, we are excited to present our findings in several key decades and hope to dive deeper into what these trends mean. First, our team is going to introduce their decade and give a quick overview of the trends.
Hi, my name is Dorothy Lubin, and I'll be going over the 1930s and 1940s, which is about World War II, and there's a lot of speculation following World War I. A lot of people were anxious about what was to come, and that was shown through their works.
Hey, I'm Alex. I'm going to be speaking on the 1960s, where there was a huge influence coming from the Cold War and the space race. You see themes that have continued from the 1950s, including space travel and aliens, but you also see themes that are reintroduced from World War II in the 1940s.
And I'm Juliet, and I'm going to be talking about the 1980s. There was the creation of the internet in 1983, and so computers became an integral part of everyday life during this era. Fandom shifted to computer worlds from fanzines and really connected readers to the cyber world. Authors allowed readers to live in this science fiction reality.
Awesome, thanks guys. So our first question for today is going to be, what were the defining heroes and villains of science fiction during your decade?
Okay, so in World War II, since there was a lot of conflicts happening, what happened was the heroes would be the Allied and the Westernized people, and their prominent figure was Captain America, who was very nationalistic and patriotic, and you could see that in his red, white, and blue colors, symbolizing the American people's pride. And the villains would be anyone opposing Western culture, maybe in particular the Nazis or any of the countries in the Axis powers, and anyone who were growing in power and opposing the U.S. nationalism.
All right, how about the 60s?
So in the 1960s, the real main hero was the space race, while the villains were the nuclear warfare. During this time, many people, they were fearful of the warfare and what it would do to society and Earth in general. In this period was also very influenced by the space race because they saw this as a new opportunity to go new places and have new advances. Especially in one of my magazine's covers, you see this rocket getting loaded up 2x2 animals as if it's Noah's Ark, as it's the hope for society.
That's interesting that in both decades, sort of like the war that was going on influenced heroes and villains. How about in the 1980s?
So in the 1980s, villains and heroes were kind of portrayed two different ways, but one of the main ways was as cyber warriors or virtual reality dreamers and hackers and underworld lowlifers in this unreal and nightmarish world and setting. So for instance, in one of the covers that I looked at, Neuromancer, we can see this computerized matrix in the background, which introduces the reader to this sci-fi punk and technological book. The main character was a console cowboy and a human computer hacker that dwelled in this cyberspace. So there was a lot of influence on this cyber world and matrix. The main hero was a cyber warrior who helped this powerful artificial intelligence take control of a virtual reality global network known as the Matrix.
All right, so our next question is, what would you say the defining trend of your decade was, and why was it the defining trend in that decade?
During the 1930s to the 1940s, due to the World War I's impact on people and they have a lot of speculation. So they were really wary of the years to come. There was a lot of unrest in Europe, and there was the possibility of a second war was approaching really quickly. So for example, in The Shape of Things to Come, H.G. Wells writes about how war breaks out in Europe, the society takes control, and it affects the technological advancement that happens during World War I. So the civilization takes over, is westernized. However, everyone has the same social status, which reflects early worries of the Red Scare and communism. Well, as in Swastika Night, there's an alternative history, and this kind of reflects the anxiety that people were feeling. So in this alternative history, the Nazis won World War II, and they took over. And all prior history of the Nazis not ruling was destroyed. So it kind of reflected what could happen if things didn't turn out as people wanted it to turn out.
Yeah, in the 1960s, one of the defining trends was people's worry, especially over destroying the earth, destroying society with all these new dangerous technologies such as like the nuclear weapons. And people were really anxious, and it kind of made people scared. Like I said, the fear is the villain in the 1960s mainly. And then one of the other defining trends is the optimistic energy of the space race. The space race really brought on new opportunities and new discoveries that people were really excited about.
Yeah, and then during the 1980s, people were more connected than ever due to the creation of internet. Many people also feared the power of this artificial intelligence that was represented in so many science fiction novels and book covers because it was so newly introduced into so many people's lives, and people really didn't have a good understanding of what it actually was or what power was real versus futuristic, and so that was main fear and trend during this era.
All right, and our last question is going to be, how do the heroes and villains relate to the historic event or period?
So the hero, the central figure for the Americans and just the Allied powers in general, was Captain America, and he first appeared in comic books in March 1941. So it happened during World War II, and he was portrayed as strong. He had a lot of bravado, and of course, what better propaganda than a Nazi fighting dressed in red, white, and blue?
Yeah, during this time period, the new nuclear technology and the missiles were really portrayed as enemies because they brought so much fear into society. Sometimes covers even lacked a hero to really represent the lack of hope and trust in the proper use of this weaponry. In many covers, there was the space race to be the hero, though, because it brought new optimism for society.
So another way in the 1980s that science fiction was very influenced by this futuristic technology and artificial intelligence was in the Marvel superheroes. And Marvel Comics incorporated various forms of advanced technology through their characters' gadgets and equipment and character suits. And all of this had to do after the invention of the internet in 1983. So for example, Iron Man's suit and armor has various components dependent on the internet. For starters, how would Tony Stark pilot his suit without the help of Jarvis, which stands for just a very intelligent system? Jarvis was a highly advanced, computerized, artificial intelligence that helped manage Tony Stark's technological matters.
Thank you, everyone, for talking about your decades. We will be right back with a special guest. Hi, welcome back to Heroes and Villains Throughout History. My name is Jack Maley, and I am the moderator. Right now, we're going to have an interview with Ms. Vyers, who is a librarian here at Georgia Tech and works on humanities as well as the science fiction circulation here at Tech. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
So our first question today is, why do you think science fiction reflects current day anxiety so well, and why is this genre in particular an outlet for society's problems?
So science and technology change regularly. They change even daily sometimes. And human beings, we find change inherently scary. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's part of it. As one example, libraries that support science programs, in order to support accreditation for the university, have to make sure that some of our resources are no more than 5 years old, simply because anything older than that is going to be so out of date as to be completely incorrect in some cases. So I think the fact that it's a constant cycle of change, that there's always more, we're always learning more, and I think that that's something that we can never kind of pin down and say, okay, well, now we know how that works.
Right.
Because then once we do, then we need to find out what that leads us to discover next. So part of it's the change element. Part of it is that it opens new possibilities, and they aren't always great. Sometimes the new possibilities are exciting, and sometimes they bring up the idea of, should we do this? If we do this, what happens? Which is one of the essential questions of science fiction. What if? Right. What if we do this? Frankenstein's a good example. So we talked in your class about how Frankenstein was sort of the original science fiction novel, like where that came from. So that was asking the question, electricity, which was a new technology at that time. Right. It was published in 1818. If we can use electricity to reanimate dead people, what does that do? What situation does that put us in? What responsibility do we have to the things that we create? What kind of relationships are we going to have with them? As it turns out, Victor and the creature are not. It's not good.
Exactly.
It's not a good family relationship. Frankenstein is also a novel about parenting, about really bad parenting.
Right.
So it opens up a lot of new possibilities, and I think that that's intriguing at the same time that it's threatening. and that's a very potent combination in the things that human beings like to poke at and see
Right.
what happens. Science and technology have effects on society, so they aren't just something that happens in a vacuum. We can't just say, oh, well, we discovered this new thing, and okay, that's fine, but it
Right.
doesn't really lead to anything. So if we look back at the Industrial Revolution, when science fiction was getting started, that changed how work is accomplished. We've got industrial factories for the first time. Social structure changed as a result of that. So, it used to be you'd get married, you'd have a dozen kids, they'd all work on your farm.
Mhm.
Well, maybe half of your kids work in a factory now, and that factory's, an hour or two or further away
Right.
from the farm. So it changed family structures. Transportation changed, access to travel, and we see that in Fantastic Voyage science fiction stories.
Mhm.
So when we look at things like Journey to the Center of the Earth, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So as transportation changed, you didn't have to own a horse or multiple horses or a carriage.
Right.
You could purchase a ticket, and that became increasingly affordable over time. So that's another way that it really changed how people were able to move around. You could live further away from your family and still see
Yeah.
them.
And even though those things might seem like normal now, they're probably somewhat scary and new, like at first.
Absolutely, especially because seatbelts weren't a thing in the first cars.
Right.
Locomotives burned wood and coal. There were actual embers, and it could be an unpleasant experience if you were too close to that. So it was all brand new in the way that some of the stuff we're seeing now is all brand new, and it had that same excitement and that same what does it mean? Rocket technology made America's space age possible.
Mhm.
And I point to rockets, but there's a whole host of science and technology beyond that.
Yeah.
Keeping people safe in space, among other things. The internet changed social structure indelibly. I think we're still coping with that.
Yeah.
It also changed the types of jobs that people can do. So, there was no such thing as a social media manager,
Mhm.
30 years ago.
Yeah. And no one would even really know what it meant.
Exactly. Whereas now, you can actually get paid to tweet. That
Yeah.
is the thing you can do. Doxing wasn't really a thing in the same way. Sharing somebody's personal information required a great deal more effort.
Yeah.
Having an online persona wasn't a thing. Gaming with people on the other side of the world simultaneously.
Right. Not even possible.
Not even possible. Personal branding wasn't really a thing in the same way.
Yeah.
The idea that people would know a lot about you before you walked into an internship interview was harder
Mhm.
for them to do that. And actually that brings up a science fiction episode of Black Mirror.
Mhm.
Well, all of Black Mirror is science fiction.
Right.
But have you seen the one where it gets into the idea of rating services, so things like Yelp? And
Oh, where
Google
you kind of
reviews?
rate each other, and then people have stars. Yeah.
Yeah, so you rate people on your experience with them.
Mhm.
And there are certain things that are available to people with higher rates. And I think the main character misses a flight because she didn't have the right number of stars. And then she had a tantrum in the airport, and then everyone around her gave her 1 star. So that's sort of commenting on how that was becoming more and more a part of our culture.
Yeah.
So those are the reasons that I think this is something that continues to reflect our anxieties really well.
Yeah. In our work, we studied sort of the internet age, the 90s, as something where the heroes and villains of sci-fi really started to change because, like you said, there was a huge change and people were really scared about automation and AI, and it sort of opened a new horizon that really hadn't been considered before.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.